Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Most importantly, thank you, everyone, for being here on a wonderful evening when you could be enjoying life elsewhere, and yet you choose to be here to discuss public policy. I think that augurs very, very well for the future of our nation. Looking at that chart, when it came out, I think it was put together by the Joint Committee on Taxation. It reminds me of a story that President Reagan used to tell about the bureaucracy that one has to go through in order to buy a car in the Soviet Union. Some of you may have heard that story. It probably was about the same, maybe a little less complicated. The story that President Reagan told was of a man who went through all the trials and tribulations and stopped, got his piece on every little circle and star and made the right jumps, and finally ended up before an important bureaucrat who stamped all the paperwork and said, "Well, comrade, congratulations. You've fulfilled every single requirement to obtain a vehicle. Please come back here to this office in 10 years and pick up your keys." And the Soviet citizen isn't done. He looks at the bureaucrat and says, but comrade bureaucrat, in 10 years you say morning or afternoon? And the bureaucrat looks at him, and he's a little irritated, and he says, "Comrade, you're picking up your vehicle in 10 years. What does it matter if it's morning or afternoon?" And the Soviet citizen says, "Well, you see, comrade, the plumber is coming in the morning." So, I used to tell another one, whenever I see an assembly of this size to talk about, the vital future of this nation, to discuss laws that arouse quite a bit of disagreement and acrimony. It reminds me of another story that Reagan used to tell about freedom of speech in the two respective countries. So he spoke of a friend who visited the Soviet Union and arrived, ran into a disgruntled Soviet citizen and said, "Listen, you Americans keep lecturing us about freedom of speech. What gives? We have freedom of speech here." And the American citizen says, "Well, you see, sir, we have the real freedom of speech in America. If things don't go the right way, I can make an appointment at the White House. And at the right time, I can march into the President's office, into the Oval Office, and pound my fist on the table and say, 'President Reagan, you're doing a lousy job. I can get away with it.' But the Soviet citizen's not impressed. He says, 'Got freedom of speech in the Soviet Union. Anytime I can make an appointment at the Kremlin and go past all the guards and security and march into General Secretary Gorbachev's office. I can pound my fist on his table and I can tell him, "Comrade General Secretary, I think President Reagan is doing a lousy job." So, jokes aside, the ability to gather together and discuss these matters is crucial. And we ought to treasure it for everything that we've got, because it doesn't exist in a whole lot of other places in the world. So I do want to thank the El Dorado Hills Tea Party for hosting this forum on Obamacare tonight. And like I said, look around you. This is truly the American spirit at work. It's obvious that the great awakening of the American people is underway, and your engagement in what is, one of the most significant public policy debates of our history, I think that's the force that will ultimately save our nation from a very dangerous descent into the doldrums of socialism. In a recent book, Dr. Larry Arnn, the president of Hillsdale College, where Mr. Sandifer is an alumnus, makes a very important point. He says, since the nature of a representative republic allows us, the sovereign people, we're the sovereigns in this country, not Congress, not the president, we're the sovereigns. And since the nature of this republic allows us, the sovereigns, to act only once every 2 years, our role in governance in the meantime is to engage in public discourse, to do precisely this: to think and to talk rather than to act. And think about it, that's very important. We think and we talk, and only then we act. And furthermore, the only way we can act is if we persuade the majority of Americans to join our cause. But there's something very special as a result of that. The beauty of that deliberative process is that after much thinking and talking, when we do finally act, we will never have to look the American people in the eye and say, "Well, you've got to pass this bill to find out what's in it." And so, while I'm very honored to partake in this discussion, I cannot help but notice that I find myself in rarefied company on the panel. On a cursory glance, perhaps I don't belong. I can't lay claim to being a noted academic or a litigator or the author of multiple books or the author of one book or a practitioner of medicine or a chief executive officer of a hospital for that matter. But instead, I come here with a very different type of foundation for my remarks. Now, we have to admit that most of the discussion about Obama's takeover of healthcare is academic, since most of the law is simply not yet in effect, at least its most dangerous parts. Perhaps it is also worth noting that our nation is familiar with the miseries of socialism only by reputation, only from the words and suffering of others. So I suspect the reason I'm here is because I learned them by experience. In essence, I was born into Obamacare, as strange as it sounds. But of course, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't known as such. The principles were the same. Government control of every aspect of care and the resulting severe shortages and brutal rationing. Unless, of course, you were a member of the communist elite, at which point you were entitled to all sorts of special hospitals guarded by machine gun-toting security men and special doctors trained somewhere outside the Soviet Union, preferably in the West or as close to the West as you could get. So, suffice it to say that my family was not anywhere near the communist elite, and as a result, I nearly died. So when I was born, both my mother and I developed an infection. Mine was less severe, while hers was sepsis. If there are any medical professionals in the room, they would tell you that sepsis is a rapidly spreading infection of the blood, which is almost always fatal if not treated immediately with antibiotics. In the hospital where I was born, happened to have a shortage of antibiotics. In fact, they're usually reserved in large quantities for the special hospitals for high-rank party officials and other favored cronies of the state. I mean, if you look at folks in charge of the Soviet Union, they were usually decrepit. The joke about one of them, Mr. Chernenko, was that he was battery-powered because he was on dialysis and carried a machine attached to him wherever he went. But our salvation, the fact that we're both alive, lay in the simple fact that my grandparents were both doctors at that hospital where my mom had wisely chosen to give birth. They, like many other doctors, hoarded antibiotics to deal with the shortage. After all, that was the only way you could manage. And they are the reason both of us lived. Now, when he was an adolescent, my father developed appendicitis, fairly common. I grew up hearing stories of distant relatives and elderly family friends passing away because the ambulance wouldn't come for them. Now, we take for granted the steady and reassuring voice of a 911 operator answering an angered call with, well, 911, what's your emergency? And then reassuring the patient, well, we're dispatching paramedics right away. Now, in contrast, the cold and callous catchphrase of the Soviet world of rationing was, how old's the patient? And, the reason I tell these is, as shocking and terrifying as these stories may seem, they're more than just figments of the past buried for all eternity in the ashes of history. They're not. They're, quite the contrary, the blunt warnings of history to not take them for granted, lest our nation be destined to suffer through the brutal reality when these stories are no longer unique, but ubiquitous. But let us not make the mistake of consigning such horror solely to the Soviet Union. It would be comforting indeed just to say, well, that was the Soviet Union with all its warts and it'll never happen to anyone ever again. Look at the world as it is today, and misery has been the fate of other nations who have succumbed to the same siren song. In Great Britain, today the State Rationing Board for Healthcare, known by its Orwellian acronym of NICE, what harm could a board called NICE do, right? I mean, you just imagine people smiling, kind of like the GM. No, not like the GMB. But NICE makes its quite unnice decisions based in part on the, quote, social usefulness of the treatment. And the result has been, for example, the denial of vital cancer drugs whose life-extending potential was deemed insufficient given their cost. And I found this very poignant. The leading British cancer researcher recently issued this plea. I think in part to the British Parliament, I think in part to the rest of the world not to repeat Britain's folly. It says this: some people get a few months extra survival, it's true, but others get 3 or 4 years more from these drugs. And yet all at the National Health Service, patients are being denied the opportunity to find out whether they respond. He goes on to say, the inequity is appalling, the bureaucracy unbelievable, and what also concerns cancer doctors is that we cannot do the best for our patients. A story published just this Monday reports that routine cataract surgeries, more or less outpatient procedures are now being rationed by NICE, with 57% of providers denying them to patients until they're on the verge of blindness. So with a $700 billion cut to Medicare enacted into law as part of Obamacare, coupled with the creation of the Independent Payment Advisory Board to ration the resulting shortages, are tragic anecdotes like these truly far from our shores? I don't think so. And let us also not make the mistake of assuming that such grotesque results are unique to healthcare. Quite contrary, history abounds with the warnings that shortages and rationing spring up wherever and whenever government controls present toxic fines. Let us consider this point before the left does, because I think they will pretty soon. What's even more basic and necessary than medicine? Few things are, but what is required by every living and breathing human being just about every day of their lives?
Water.
Food. So, tell you another story. Remember well the day we arrived into the United States, not the least of which was because we forgot my brother's violin and my grandma's hat on the airplane. We're so excited to get here. Not the least of which because my blind grandma fell on top of me on the escalators we were approaching the immigration station. A lot of bags falling down. It was quite an entry. But my very first real foray into American life when we arrived here in '94 was a visit to Safeway on our very first evening in the country. And so, having grown up with 5-hour lines for bread, empty shelves, disgruntled cashiers, and rationing cards for tasteless mystery meat, I was stunned. I walked in to find a cornucopia of colors, this vibrant abundance of goods vying for my attention, one more appetizing than the next. They had like 10 different types of French fries. Some of them had pepper on them. Bananas weren't a luxury anymore. I used to get bananas for my birthday. But, they weren't a luxury. In fact, they sold for pennies, literally. Pineapples, which I'd only seen in botany books, were assembled into this mountain, which seemed about to topple over just from its sheer size. And instead of waiting in line for whatever loaf of bread was left for us, we couldn't decide which of the plethora of loaves to buy. But as freedom turns scarcity into abundance, it works in reverse as well. Socialism and government control shrivel prosperity into desperate poverty. When the Soviet Union asserted centralized control over food production, the result was a famine rivaled only by historic bouts of pestilence and world war. It was in 1932 that the government decreed that food was too important to be left to the tumultuous and irresponsible profit-driven markets. That sound familiar?
Yes.
I mean, after all, it's a basic right. It's something we eat every day. Why would we leave it to those profiteers and speculators? So the brilliant minds overnight stipulated that all food was to become state property. This was in August of 1932. And tight constraints were placed on the food production and delivery while forcing peasants to reach absolutely unrealistic harvesting goals. So, in other words, you now grow this much, you're now going to grow this much, you don't get to keep any of it, and if we catch you with some of it, we kill you. That worked out well, right? Right? I don't think so. In fact, by the end of 1933, and this is a tragic point, up to 10 million Soviet citizens were dead of famine. Took a year. So let us never forget that freedom alone is the source of prosperity. Whether the subject matter is hot pockets or health care, let us remember that when the critics assail the current system, and there is a lot to assail, their concerns arise not from too much freedom in the marketplace, but from too little. And we ought to make that point and bring it home. Now imagine if the government created the conditions where your employer dictated your choice of grocery store. Imagine if government required you to only buy groceries in your neighborhood, rather than comparing prices elsewhere. After all, we cannot buy health insurance from the next state over or 5 states over. Imagine if government prohibited you from picking and choosing what groceries to buy. Imagine if you couldn't go to Safeway to pick up bread and bananas. That you could only buy bread and bananas in combination with, sirloin, shrimp, cereal, cat litter, and milk, even though you were a vegetarian, was lactose intolerant, and you absolutely hated cats. Well, we laugh, but, in the present system and under Obamacare, we cannot cater a policy to our needs. We're forced to buy coverage that the exchanges would force on us, that state law presently forces on us. For example, pregnancy coverage for postmenopausal women.
Yeah, it's kind of strange.
You know, Congressman McClintock tells this story of a friend who developed bursitis. Not, not a killer, not ultimately something, annoying, but ultimately not something that ruins your life. And his friend told the congressman, well, I can't get health insurance. I've got a pre-existing condition. And what's worse is I went to the health insurance company and said, look, let's just create a basket. Insure me. I don't care about bursitis. I'll deal with it. Insure me against stroke, heart attack, the effects of being run over by a bus, and on and on and on. Forget bursitis. I'll take care of it on my own. And the result was, well, we'd love to do that. We'd love for you to be our customer, but we can't. It's against the law. Go on. Imagine if your grocery store lived in fear of bankrupting punitive damages and was forced to pass along to you the budget-busting cost of insuring against it. I don't think I would have found anywhere near the abundance that I saw at that Safeway in 1994. And that's just the misery caused by the rationing from government supplanting freedom in the marketplace. The other side of the Obamacare coin is the $1 trillion in taxes which will saddle our economy. And these are taxes on hospitals, taxes on over-the-counter drugs, taxes on health savings account withdrawals, extra taxes on investment to the tune of 43% for the so-called rich, most of whom happen to be small businesses filing as subchapter S corporations, on which we, by the way, count to create all the jobs we need to get out of the current misery. Taxes on medical devices that will undoubtedly lead to fewer pacemakers, fewer stents, fewer crucial life-saving tools. Of course, the tax on not owning a health plan that Mr. Sandifer alluded to, under which the federal government now possesses the power to force any American to buy anything the government chooses, and many more. I was told I only have 20 minutes, so I can't read to you the entire list of the taxes. But suffice it to say, it's $1 trillion in taxes. It sounds immense, but yet beyond a certain point, such astronomical numbers cease to make sense. Arthur Laffer, the famous economist, chairman of Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, refers to these numbers as mega numbers, not M-E-G-A, M-E-G-O. My eyes glaze over. So what's $1 trillion? Well, if you do the numbers, it's over 13,000 for every family of four at a time when most families are struggling to make ends meet. And they say healthcare is expensive now. I don't get it. But, so this gets me to my final point. Most advocates of Obamacare ground their passion in the notion that health care is a basic right. Well, perhaps they have a point. Perhaps, one of our side's mistakes has been to vocally dispute that notion because we have a visceral reaction to it. That doesn't sound right. What do you mean? You have, you're granting to one a right to another's labor? That's not America. We have an amendment on the books prohibiting slavery, so the reaction at first is visceral. But let's look into it a little further. Founders spoke of a basic right to counsel. I also have an admission to make. I'm also an attorney by trade. It's in the Sixth Amendment. But the context was not that, here's a free lawyer. It is that way now. The original founders' point was not that. It was that government had no right to interfere in the ability of a defendant to be properly represented. You have a right to counsel. Not you have a right to another man's labor. Government has to get out of the way so you can go and make your arrangements with someone who will give you proper representation in court. So we ought to renew that argument in the context of this fight as well. When it concerns a right as fundamental as our decisions over our own health, what right does government have to interfere? If health care truly were a basic right, then the argument we could make very, very clearly is that government that precludes access to health care, that destroys it in the manner that we just covered, with brutal rationing, with shortages, with severe taxation, that government breaks a social compact with its people and ought to be repudiated in the strongest of terms. And I think the American people are about to do so in November. I think they're going to keep in mind Thomas Jefferson's poignant words that he wrote just 10 days before he died in 1826. Said, all eyes are opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth, that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, not a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. And if we're still not sure what draw freedom has on humanity, I personally look no further than the story of my grandmother, who after all spent most of her life under socialized government-run healthcare. She was born in 1911, so 6 years before the Russian Revolution. And one day shortly after the revolution, a band of Bolsheviks, which, by the way, does anybody know what a Bolshevik means in Russian? No? How about member of an overwhelming majority, like member of the 99%? Familiar, right? They arrived at her parents' doorstep to remedy a serious offense. The crime being that my grandmother's parents happened to own a house. And exercising a crude Russian version of eminent domain, the thugs ordered that the house be immediately turned over to the local Communist Party. And when my grandmother's father protested, he was taken away, never to be seen again, and the rest of the family expelled from their home. But after all, what's the cost to give universal health care? My grandmother spent the next 7 decades living in the Soviet Union and nurturing a quiet but nonetheless fervent determination to persevere through the scourge of communism long enough to someday see freedom firsthand. And she did. She finally arrived in the United States at the age of 82, resolved to do whatever it took to spend her final years as an American citizen. And for her, that meant spending over a year clutching an old black tape player on which my dad recorded questions and answers to the naturalization exam that she muttered to herself day in and day out. People who came for a casual visit thought she was a little nuts. But in the year 2000, aged 88 and completely blind, she presented herself to the Immigration and Naturalization Service examiners. And the examiner was absolutely stunned. She told us she had never before seen a blind 88-year-old woman so determined to pass the citizenship test, which my grandmother did with flying colors. 4 years later, she passed away, but by then a patriotic American citizen and voter, and proud to the last day of completing her journey from brutal force to bountiful liberty in America. So, let us find inspiration in every past triumph of liberty. And let the word go forth from this gathering today that under the watchful eyes of history, we cast our lot with freedom. Thank you.